All right, everyone, I think it's time to begin. Welcome to all of our attendees, and thank you for joining us for this webinar presented by the Alliance for Performing Arts Conferences. APAC is Arts Midwest, Arts Northwest, ArtsReady, Association of Performing Arts Professionals, Folk Alliance International, North American Performing Arts Managers and Agents, North Carolina Presenters Consortium, International Performing Arts for Youth, and South Arts and Western Arts Alliance. A few things we need to cover before we start today's webinar. When you opened the webinar today, a control panel appeared on your screen. Closed captioning is available for today's webinar by clicking on the link pinned in the chat box on the control panel. And if you wish, you can then hide the control panel with the little orange arrow. We will not be taking questions during the webinar, so the question box is closed, as all of our questions were submitted in advance. From the hundreds of questions that were submitted, our panelists have chosen some of the most frequently asked to address in today's presentation. When you close the webinar, a short survey will appear, and we greatly appreciate any and all of your feedback, so please do complete the survey. Now, without further ado, let's get started. To say a few words and to introduce our host and moderator, please welcome Folk Alliance International's Executive Director, Angus Finnan.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you, Tressa. I'm joining you from my home in Kansas City on the traditional territory of the Kansa and Osage Nations. On behalf of the board and staff of Folk Alliance International, I'd like to thank all of our partners who Tressa mentioned from the Alliance of Performing Arts Conferences for their ongoing collaborative work related to the issues of today, but also advocacy at large for the field. The global issues of the COVID-19 pandemic have had an immediate impact on all of our organizations and the communities we represent and serve. And we realize that this is a very stressful and unsure time for everyone. But as a cohort, we are committed to providing resources and support for our members and the creative sector at large. We continue to advocate and communicate with foundations and organizations on behalf of our collective field, and we are sharing all of the latest resources on our respective websites. So please do look to each of the organizations as they relate to you, your membership, or the community that's served by each of the organizations in this cohort. We will all get through this. Things will get better, and we will return to some new normal in time. So it's important that we look to the future as much as we deal with the unprecedented events of today, and that we appreciate the important role that our creative community and the arts play in restoring that sense of community. It's exciting to see the celebration of life and creativity online, and the quick transition that has been made to providing access to the arts through our community, and providing that reassurance for the fans and community who participate with all of our artists and organizations. We have an important panel today. The webinar and the panelists who have joined us will be introduced shortly. But today's webinar is entitled Ask an Expert, Contracts, Insurance, Visas, Employment, and Legislation in the COVID-19 Era. And I'd like to especially thank Matthew Covey of Tamizdat, who in partnership with us very quickly assembled this panel of experts in order to answer the pressing questions that many of you have. So without further ado, I'd like to turn you over to Matthew Covey.
Thanks, Angus, and thanks for the opportunity to bring this to our various communities. There's a ton of questions, a lot of really good questions, and going through them last night and trying to sort out who gets which it was a challenge. I hope we answer as many of these questions as we can. There are a fair number that were very specific, which we may not get to, but we're trying to address the broader framing questions that people had in each of the topics that our panelists speak in. The first panelist I would like to introduce is going to be speaking about a topic which is very difficult to talk about right now, which is the wide variety of provisions that are coming out of DC right now in the relief packages. I do not envy the job of trying to explain those in 7 minutes or 11 minutes or whatever it might be. There were a fair number of labor and employment questions. Many of those are implicated in the relief packages. We hope that we will, in a future webinar in the not so distant future, be able to dig more deeply into those employment and labor questions. So some of those questions have been collapsed into the questions we've given to Heather Noonan, who is the Vice President of Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras. Heather joins us today from DC. And I'm going to prompt you, Heather, with the questions as we go through them. Feel free to range wherever you think is best from those questions into information that you think would be most pertinent for this constituency. The first and broadest question that we got from the community was the one that I think is probably the hardest to answer, which is what kind of arts organizations, what kinds of relief can arts organizations be expecting from the relief packages, specifically for nonprofits, performing arts centers, festivals, commission-based agents, independent artists, and all the various small businesses that make up the performing arts community. Will arts organizations see any form of relief? And will there be direct relief to them, or is it going to be the same kinds of relief that other businesses are expecting? And what can we expect from, if anything, from state and federal arts councils and endowments?
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. That question is itself an hour-and-a-half webinar, and I'll do my best to help folks understand where things are as of today. Good to just keep in mind there have now been 3 relief packages passed by Congress. 2 of them are signed into law. The third one, the biggest one, to more than $2 trillion of relief, is set to be signed into law today. And I think I am where everyone else is, and just trying to rapidly unpack how all the forms of relief relate to each other and where the opportunities are for the arts sector, both as organizations and individuals. And the short answer to the question is yes, there are opportunities there. But I think it's important to remember that where we are right now in terms of relief is meant to be a bridge to survival for the next few months. It will not be enough to make whole any organization or individual that's making their way through this crisis. So as advocates, what we've been aiming to do is really frame up where the need is. And what we're aiming to do next is understand how these current relief opportunities provide access to arts organizations and individuals, but then also to quickly assess what need isn't met by them and what more is needed. There will be some limited forms of direct assistance to individuals and organizations. I have to say, some of that is happening without waiting for the federal government to make it happen. And we're seeing all of the terrific independent efforts that are coming together, both from funders and individuals who are jump-starting relief efforts. In terms of federal resources, this third package includes $75 million for the National Endowment for the Arts. 40% of that funding would be administered by state arts agencies, and the remaining available in direct grants. The language in the bill provided pretty much unprecedented opportunities for how the agency flexibly uses that funding. It will be able to waive matching requirements for the support it puts out into the sector. And it also is allowed to provide those resources to support general operating expenditures. So it won't necessarily be project specific as we've seen in the past. But we know that that's just a really modest down payment on what's really needed. So advocates are definitely going to keep organizing around a bigger form of direct support for the arts sector. In the meantime, I think the aim of congressional leaders was to provide workforce-based relief that would work across industries. So there are opportunities for the arts there. And again, I just want to emphasize our big goal as a community is to figure out how these help and how they don't, so that we can really articulate what more is needed. In all three packages total, there have been first economic injury disaster loans directly applied to the SBA for those, paid leave provisions that are meant to help both self-employed individuals and employers offer sick leave and extended family and medical leave subsidized by the government. And it's important to know that those phrases of sick leave and family and medical leave are now much, much broader than what we've ever understood them to be. So for instance, being home to care for a child whose school has closed is now a qualifying factor for that subsidized leave. The two agencies that write the guidelines and do the rulemaking for how that paid leave works are doing that work this week. So the Department of Labor and Department of Treasury are ironing out those details. And once we have them, we'll know a lot more about functionally how they apply to real life situations of artists and arts organizations. And I just want to kind of mention that it's really helpful for folks to frame up the questions they have about these, because the agencies will be in a posture of needing to provide the answers. Then in addition to that, we've got newly expanded unemployment benefits. So in the first bill, they authorized states, the federal government authorized states to offer expanded unemployment benefits that are meant to meet the needs for COVID-related situations. But what's happened in the third bill is they've further expanded those unemployment benefits so that they would be eligible, the eligible applicants would include self-employed workers. So this is, again, an unprecedented change in the way we've known access to unemployment benefits to work. And that will be, I think, one helpful opportunity. Again, we'll have to see how the rulemaking works on this and how each state will administer these benefits. It'll be really important for individuals and organizations who are helping individuals to be really closely connected to their state's Department of Labor so they can see how this will functionally work. But the kind of the heart and soul of this third relief package is really meant to help employers and businesses keep as many people on the payroll as possible. And the way that they're aiming to do this is to provide incentives and direct federal subsidy for paycheck protection is the phrase that's being used. So for organizations who have up to 500 employees, there will be an opportunity to apply to their local lender for about 2 months of payroll coverage. And the idea here would be to have employers take out a loan that's backed by the SBA. So this is different than the direct application for economic injury disaster loans to the SBA. Applying to local lenders, the amount of the loan, again, is going to be determined by looking at the past year payroll, taking a monthly average of that and multiplying it times 2.5. So the maximum loan amount is up to $10 million, and you factor that by calculating 2.5 times average monthly payroll. If an employer then for 8 weeks after they open the loan can demonstrate they used those expenses to keep workers on the payroll, the amount of the loan would be forgiven. So it essentially turns into a grant to help keep workers on the payroll. So the incentive, though, is that if when the employer applies for this loan forgiveness, they have to demonstrate that they have in fact kept their workers on the payroll. Right. So it's reduced, the forgiveness is reduced by the amount of positions lost or pay diminished. Okay. So when you look at the web of these things and how they work together, I think one of the biggest challenges is to see how payroll incentives, connect to paid leave, and connect to unemployment benefits. And for both, there's opportunities for self-employed workers in really all of these spaces. And so we'll have to kind of help, I think, folks understand how you sequence access to these forms of relief.
That makes sense. Just very briefly, I think what a lot of our arts organizations are struggling with right now is whether they're looking at no money coming in and they're looking at a lot of money going out and trying to make this panic decision, like, do I lay people off? And it seems like the answer to that question is the calculation being, I'd rather have people on unemployment if unemployment is available than be draining our coffers. The answer to that is, like, don't necessarily lay people off yet. These packages do offer a kind of relief that is very likely to be helpful for arts organizations and their employees.
I mean, I think every situation is going to be really different,
right,
one from the other. And again, it's going to be a matter of looking across the full spectrum, understanding each organization and individuals' needs too. Self-employed individuals, applying for a loan to essentially keep themselves on their payroll. What's the benefit of that compared to the unemployment benefits and these paid leave benefits that individuals can also access? But I think just one note, because I know some employers have already had to make those hard decisions, that these payroll protection loans, if eligible, if layoffs have already happened, the employers aren't prohibited from applying from the loan, because the idea is to help them bring folks back onto the payroll.
Right.
So as long as positions have been restored, or if pay has been diminished, it's brought back up, that form of relief is still available to employers.
Okay. Great, Heather, that's so helpful. Especially, I think, in the broad sense, it does indicate, it answers the biggest question and the most common question we were receiving, which is, do the relief packages apply to arts organizations and all the varying different kinds of arts organizations that we see, from nonprofit to for-profit to sole proprietor to contract workers? And the answer is, yeah, very likely they are going to apply to it. It's definitely worth digging into the packages and getting help and getting advice before you make any major decisions in terms of how to handle your payroll costs. Heather, that's about as much time as we have. Thank you so much for your input. I feel like we could probably ask another hour of questions, or another 2 hours or 3 hours or days of questions for you, but that's a really, really good lead in to the topic, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Matthew.
I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is one of the second most common questions that we got, which was references. People are wondering, what do they do about insurance, and what role does insurance play in the current catastrophe, the current crisis? To speak about insurance, we have with us today Paul Bassman, President and CEO of Ascend Insurance Brokerage, which is a leading insurance brokerage to the performing arts. Tough time to be in insurance right now, I imagine, Paul. So I've got a few questions for you, and again, as with Heather, feel free to vamp on these and go where you think they need to go. The main question, obviously, is coming from presenters, and the question being, do presenters' cancellation insurance cover cancellations that occur due to the pandemic? And is there insurance that can cover losses because of the pandemic?
Matthew, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So presenters, if they bound a cancellation policy prior to, say, mid-January, there's a possibility that they could have had coverage for coronavirus. There's an exclusion on these policies that is called exclusion for communicable disease. And some policies don't have that exclusion. Some offer a buyback option for communicable disease for a relatively low additional premium. So whether you have, and again, that leads to the question, do presenters typically carry cancellation insurance? Most of my clients who have indoor events only don't carry that. It's really mainly the clients who have outdoor events are the ones who carry that insurance. So not that they can't carry it, it's not common.
So cancellation, so would the cancellation insurance, as presenters look at their cancellation insurance, if they have it, are they looking specifically for communicable disease to be included, or is it fair to assume that this would be a cancellation, that a cancellation because of communicable disease would be included if it's not specifically excluded?
Exactly. If it's not specifically excluded, then it would be included.
So that's good news for people who have cancellation insurance.
Exactly.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. If events are canceled by public authorities, does that impact whether presenters may receive relief from cancellation insurance policy? There was a lot of discussion about events waiting until they were being canceled by public authorities before they did the cancellation themselves. Does that matter? And is it material to whether they will be able to collect on that insurance?
Yes and no. So basically, if a civil authority cancels your event, it is very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, for an insurance carrier to decline coverage for that cancellation. If you choose to cancel the event, then the onus is now on you to prove why cancellation was necessary. And that's the key word in the cancellation policy. It has to be a necessary cancellation. So we've been coaching our clients, you should really wait till a civil authority figure makes the cancellation. If you just can't wait, you can go ahead and do it. Just understand that a claim could be contested in that situation.
Got it. That makes sense. This is an interesting question. If an insured event is canceled, will providers of liability insurance refund premiums for events that don't happen?
No, liability insurance wouldn't have anything to do with refunding patrons. That would all come from some sort of event cancellation policy.
Sure. I think what they're meaning is that, like, in the same way that if I hired caterers and I hired lights crews and then I don't need them anymore because the event was canceled, I may not need to pay those contractors. If I've already paid for various kinds of insurance pursuant to the execution of the event, and then the event doesn't happen, is there a chance I might get a refund on that?
It's carrier specific. Some carriers might offer a refund, some won't. It really just depends on what your policy says.
Got it. Okay. Is there insurance that performers can be carrying that would provide them financial relief in the event of cancellations?
Yeah, absolutely. There's non-appearance and tour cancellation insurance. So if you're a performer that tours around the country a lot, that's a very common insurance to have. In fact, I have a client right now who's collecting on their non-appearance policy because they did not have a coronavirus exclusion, and thank goodness for that. For individual performers, say if you did do a show here or there, I imagine you could probably get it, but at that point, it really becomes to a matter of spend and budget. Are you referring to what kind of performers are you referring to in the situation?
I was thinking about an artist, so a band or an orchestra or a DJ or a dance company. Could they be individually going out and saying, you know what, I've got this whole tour coming up, I'm going to get cancellation insurance, so in case there's disease, virus.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's very common. Unfortunately, going forward, carriers are now excluding all communicable disease. So there is no coverage available anymore for the time being, and it's not going to be forever, because there was a time when SARS and avian flu and swine flu were specific exclusions, and those went away eventually, and hopefully this will go away as well.
Okay, that makes sense. How does business interruption insurance relate to all this? Some companies are arguing that their policies don't cover disruption of business, and I understand there's some court challenges to this right now.
Absolutely, it's going to be very interesting to see how it comes out. The state of New Jersey is trying to force insurers, and they're supposed to have a vote on it yesterday, and I haven't seen the results of that vote yet. But they're trying to force insurers to cover business interruption claims, even though those policies are not intended nor were they rated for that purpose. So typically, business interruption is tied to property damage, either to your facility or property damage to an adjacent facility that impedes access to your building. So it's all related to property damage. New Jersey's trying to get that pulled. Not sure where that's going. And if it is successful in New Jersey, I imagine it'll spread from state to state to state. But at this moment, there is no coverage in a business interruption policy for a pandemic.
Okay, but that's a possibility, and that's something that presenters certainly should keep an eye on. How
Absolutely.
the courts turn with that. Okay. Last question for you, because we need to wrap up. But can you recommend any resources that arts organizations, arts professionals can be looking to for information about how all this works? Are there any really good websites or agencies or anything like that out there? That obviously there are independent brokers who are a great source of information. Is there anything besides that people could be looking to?
Yeah, I would first off make sure that you have counsel that is truly in your business, that really understands what you do. Counsel meaning your attorney, and I'd almost say the attorney is even more important than the agent. I hate to put myself on the second on the peg, but having an attorney who really understands your business, that has good optics on other businesses like yours, so they have ways to compare your situation to other situations. And then of course having an insurance broker in the same way, that isn't just your broker only, that has other companies like yours, so that they can compare and contrast what other people are doing and try to do the right for you.
That makes sense. Is there any specific place that people should be looking for updates? So for example, with these New Jersey court cases, is it just watching the news, or is there an organization that is keeping the arts community abreast of changes in insurance and developments in this regard?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I tend to look at Billboard magazine and Polestar. I'm not sure of trade magazines specific for the performing arts off the top of my head. Venues Today is another one, I believe, that does a lot of work in the performing arts. They'll be giving updates on topical issues, and then just generally looking at the news.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that we've got another minute? Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is really critical?
I think we've done, we've really covered most of the bases. One more thing is that a lot of, this is interesting. So carriers are starting to provide relief on cancellation. So like Allianz, for example, is a carrier that is offering to not cancel your policy due to non-payment through June 1st. I believe the Hartford is doing mid-May. So definitely go to your agent if you can't cover your premiums. Go to your agent and find out what sort of options you have for delaying your payments. If you need money for the cash flow, you will eventually owe that money down the road. But again, I know cash flow is an issue for everybody. So if you can put those payments off to later, I imagine that would be a help to everybody.
Sure, I think everybody's trying to figure out how to get through the next 4 months, and then sort of kicking that can down the road, and can worry about that later. So thank you.
Absolutely.
That's a good thing to know. Paul, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We are moving on now to a significant question that was the majority of the questions we received online, and that relates to contracts and what happens to all the contracts for all the performances that have been scuttled due to the current crisis. Joining me now, Ali Sachedina, who's the Vice President of General Counsel of Business Affairs at JioSaavn, and Heather VanDyke, who's General Counsel and Head of Legal at South by Southwest. I am going to step out at this point and let these two take off and riff for the next 20 minutes on everything you could possibly need to know about contracts and what are going to happen in this situation. I want to do a quick disclaimer before this. We're going to get legal here. lawyers are always really nervous about giving advice to a whole group of people because we are trained to give case-specific advice to individuals that's based on the facts of whatever we're seeing. So whenever we start talking generally to a large group, especially 500 people on a webinar, it makes us nervous. So this is the disclaimer. We're giving you the best advice we can. We know that all of you are struggling to figure out what's in the contracts that you maybe never read before, and how to deal with that. Getting your heads wrapped around concepts which have never really been important and now suddenly are critically important. So we're going to give you the best ideas, the best sort of framing mechanisms you can have, but please understand that this is not legal advice. You should not be relying on what they're saying to your specific situation. If you've got really important decisions that you have to make in regards to your contracts, it's always good to get case-specific, fact-specific advice from your attorney. That being said, Ali, Heather, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, right. And I'd like to add one more disclaimer to that, and that is that the information I share is me speaking on behalf of myself and not my employer. So I just want to put that out there.
That's fair too. I'm gonna cut myself out of video here, and you guys take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. So on behalf of myself and Heather, just welcome. And we're just going to outline, obviously, the primary issues that a lot of presenters and artists are facing with regards to this current pandemic, particularly the one clause that I think a lot of us never really, included in our contracts, but never really went through them and just never really thought they would ever amount to much. And they've been the topic of a lot of conversations, and that's the force majeure clause. Heather, I will leave it to you to sort of walk us through how we should understand force majeure clauses in general.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Happy to be a part of this conversation and sharing what we can to be of assistance in this super challenging and complicated and chaotic time. I think an important first step for everybody before you start even kind of drilling into the language and specific clauses is to make sure that you have a clear idea of all of the contracts that you've entered into and kind of getting yourself organized so that you have different buckets, whether it's your vendors, if you think of them distinctly from artists or venues or various contractors that might fall outside of those groups in your mind, so that you can look at those as different groups and then look at the language within those agreements as they may vary from group to group and contract to contract, even within those same categories. So for me, I always find that a good first step is just to get very organized, because then as you start navigating the various deviations in language, it may not feel quite as overwhelming because you've kind of created your spreadsheet that has a breakdown of what language you have where, and it will help to see that kind of comparison or the through line, and you'll familiarize yourself more with what you have within each of those documents. So once you do that, if you're focusing primarily on the force majeure clause, which is obviously the kind of hot button, highly focused and magnified provision and concept and clause that people are looking at right now, I think the first place to go is, what is this? What is it? What does it mean? Even before you get to the specifics of the contract language itself, to understand what do the words force majeure even suggest or get to. And in broad strokes, a force majeure event is something that is unpredictable, or as lawyers like to use the term, unforeseeable, and it's a force that might prevent either party from performing their obligations under the contract. So oftentimes in these clauses, you'll see examples of what may be construed as a force majeure event. You'll see fires, floods, wars, riots, terrorism, act of God is in there often, and often you'll see kind of a broad catch-all that says something like, or other similar events. You want to look at your clause and see if pandemic is included. You may or not have that in there. I think that if you're not operating in the healthcare space, that might not be something that you had thought of in advance. Or it may depend on kind of your region. If you've seen some regional kind of epidemic issues, I know that, you know, I'm based in Texas, and so Zika was on my mind a couple years ago. So I kind of had thought about that at one point. But so look at your clause and see if there's anything that's related to pandemics or epidemics or health related issues. And then of course you want to look and see, is there any reference to civil or governmental authority? Because as we've seen over the last several weeks, there have been various ways in which local, state, and federal government have been involved in canceling mass gatherings or even small gatherings, and how that could be a trigger point for your particular contracts. So that's, I think, the first two steps there, getting your contracts organized, and then having kind of that basic understanding of what force majeure is, and then turning to the contracts you have, because the language within those contracts become critically important to understand what may apply or what may not apply in your situation.
And once we've made that assessment, you know, I wanted to sort of outline some of the practical and business considerations. So, you know, you're in a situation, you've gone through your agreements, you've put them in buckets, you've assessed where, how force majeure in particular applies and where it applies, and then begins the conversation. And sort of as a practical matter, like there's no black and white answer. That's the thing that's very important to remember, because, you know, it starts with this discussion with the opposing party, with whether it be a presenter or an artist or a booking agent. It begins with us sort of with you understanding that, one, we're all in this, we're all suffering, and to some degree this is something that applies, that's affecting everyone uniformly, and from a financial point of view, and sometimes unfortunately a personal level. And so when you take that into consideration, I think generally the advice is, don't start with the lawyers, start with the business side, start with a conversation with the other party about like the challenges, the inability to perform, the fact that there is someone, you need to cancel that contract, that engagement. And then when you do that, also recall, we strongly recommend that take into consideration the fact that this will pass, that you will ultimately be doing business again. And more likely than not, these are relationships that you've had, let's say with a booking agent that's gone back years. And so while you may have a clause that's been, fixed and negotiated in place, and you're now reviewing it, that there is a lot of flexibility to really have that conversation to assess how we can collectively move forward. So let's just start with that premise, like that we're all on the same page. We're not lawyering up, for lack of a better term. We're having that conversation. A lot of the questions that came in, were around deposits. Again, it's not just about, when it comes to deposits, there are a number of considerations that need to be made. First and foremost, you start with what's in the clause itself. How does it specifically address the return of deposits? And then there's also, we also appreciation of what kind of services have been rendered by each party. While you're doing that, it's also important to assess how much, each individual party has spent in performing and rendering certain services, because that sort of allows each party to sort of address how much flexibility they have with regards to the deposit. Now, at the end of the day, if the one party is insistent on returning a deposit, and that is simply what's in the agreement, then they, as much as they appreciate your concern, you have to look back on the agreement itself, the clause itself, and see what's there. And again, this is a very case-by-case basis, but that at the end of the force majeure clause, it provides your overall, your guardrails. That's your fallback. But
yeah, if I could
yeah,
add
please
to
go ahead.
that, I think I agree with Ali that it's really important that your legal and business teams are working closely together on this so that you have your legal understanding of what is in the contract, which was analyzed, drafted, and negotiated at a time when we weren't in this pandemic, right? So I think of it as the home base. It's kind of like the lighthouse, the guiding light, where we have this very challenging environment that everybody is in, trying to navigate what's next, what does the future hold, and what are your financial pathways to continue doing the work that you're doing. And so you have this document that is really a static document that lives, that you can refer back to, and then you have the kind of relationship that Ali is describing, that the kind of long historic business relationship between your partners, or even if it's not such a long historic relationship, there was some reason you were coming together to work on a collaboration in the first place. And so approaching those conversations with the information and understanding foundation of what's in your contract will help fuel and push those conversations forward. So some of your contracts might not specifically have a header that says force majeure. So you might not even be working from a place where you know where in your contract this might be. So I want to just read to you some of the kind of buzzwords. I know I mentioned them earlier, but let me read to you from a clause that may help resonate with you to understand which paragraph we're even talking about in the contract. So it would say something to the effect of, should performance of any obligation under this agreement become illegal or impossible by reason of fire, flood, storm, act of God, governmental authority, labor disputes, war, riot, or any other cause which is beyond the reasonable control of the party whose performance is affected, and the performance of such obligation is suspended during the period of hindrance, but only if the affected party provides reasonable notice of the event of force majeure and exercises reasonable diligence to remove the cause. So this particular example gives the contracting parties a lot of information about how they have to treat this particular issue. So what that means is, baked into the language that I just read is information about a notice requirement, which means contacting the other party and letting them know that you believe this force majeure event has occurred. It also speaks to what the effect of the force majeure event is, which in this context would be a suspension of the obligation to perform under the contract. You may have language in your contract that details what to do with those deposits that have been made. Maybe if the vendor can supply a list of hard costs to the other contracting party, then those hard costs will be removed from the deposit amount and the remainder be refunded. That depends on the language in your contract, and if that type of language is not there, then you may be turning to the business relationship and discussing what is realistic in terms of kind of the financial and risk transference based on your historic relationship. But that may not always work out, so you kind of have to know what's in the contract itself, which is the controlling document in this situation. So I think that it's important that you understand that if there's a notice obligation in that clause, that you're paying attention to if there's a timeline attached to that notice, which means, does it say prompt? Does it say immediate? Does it say within 5 to 10 days? And then understanding what may be the triggering event in the situation. So depending on that kind of enumerated list of triggering events like the fire, flood, storm, etc., none of those say pandemic. So if your contract says pandemic, that's one thing. If your contract says act of God, you're starting to analyze whether you think a pandemic is an act of God, which is typically a force of nature, which is often seen in the context of weather-related issues. but you may be able to make an argument there. And then of course that catch-all that references anything else that's outside of the reasonable control of a party, it seems like, okay, well, you know, mass shutdowns seem to get us there. So at what point along the continuum was notice required? You just don't want to be late on that. So making sure that you're having the conversation with the parties that you contract with is critical. And I think one of the questions that came up was, well, what do you do if one party thinks it is and the other party thinks it isn't? Again, you kind of have to lean back on what's in the contract. So you have that dialogue, and if you're not in a jurisdiction where things have been shut down, or maybe your event is taking place like July or August, and we're not that far along kind of in the future to know where this virus is going, then as we discussed earlier regarding the insurance side, you may just have to wait a little bit depending and see what your city or local government is going to do in the future, in the coming weeks or months. So I think a combination of notice, dialogue, patience will all be very helpful. And there's also a situation where that, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, okay. There's also a situation where you may not actually have this boilerplate language in your contract at all. I imagine that is a scary feeling when you look at the contract and it's not there. There are common law rights which vary by jurisdiction that I think some of you have asked about. So I know you've done your research on this, the notions of impossibility or impracticability. And so that will be very important for you to look into to understand whether in the absence of any specific clause in the contract that was negotiated, you may still have rights akin to a force majeure clause being there. Some of the things that may trigger that kind of similar effect without having language in the contract would be something like death of a person who is necessary to perform under the contract, destruction of a thing that's necessary for performance, or prevention by governmental regulation, which a lot of us, you know, depending where you are in the country now, or when your event is taking place, there's high potential that there's been a governmental regulation at this point that may preclude you from being able to perform. So the hope is not lost if you don't have the language in your contract that specifically states that there's even force majeure capabilities, let alone kind of the enumerated examples of what constitutes a force majeure event. So keep close tabs on that, and I think it's important when you're kind of cataloging that you notate that. You know, this contract has this language, this contract has no language, so that way as you're navigating this, you have kind of your full picture and you feel that you're armed with enough information to whether you're seeking your own legal advice through the counsel, whether they're in-house or they're your outside counsel, you can kind of bring them that package and you've already done a lot of the legwork so that you can obviously save time and costs on that. I think some of you asked questions, and I don't know how we are in time.
We have about a minute left.
Oh, yeah, okay, we have a minute. Do you want to quickly talk through some of the thoughts or some of the considerations that people should make if there wasn't actually a contract that's signed or was partially executed?
Again, that's a great question. So we don't, you know, we're not one party signed it, the other party didn't. Again, it really depends on a lot of considerations that need to be made before you point to whether there is or isn't. You know, they vary from, you know, whether someone has relied on it, whether terms were substantially negotiated, where there's an email that says, okay, we've agreed on all the points. Again, it's about whether the agreements, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's very case specific. So just because an agreement isn't signed doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a contract. So you need to just, again, consult with counsel and really assess before, you know, making a conclusion one way or the other. Heather, am I missing anything there?
No, I was looking at the time. I think
I think we've run over. Yeah, we've definitely run over.
But I think we've got a thumbs up that we can eat up just a couple more minutes here. Matthew, is that true?
You guys can
Or
go
Oh,
on.
okay.
You can go on a little bit
Maybe.
more. I can sum up visa stuff really fast. Nobody's going anywhere. So yeah, keep going for a little bit.
okay, we've been given permission to eat up more
Yeah.
time. Cool.
Please.
Yeah, so I think that the specific question that came in was if there's an offer memo, but not the long form agreement, what is the penalty for cancellation? And then how binding is a contract only signed by one party, which kind of both speak to the same issue that Ali just walked through. And first and foremost, if you have the offer memo, but not the long form contract, you have to look back at that offer memo to see what the specific terms are of that agreement. But if the concern is about the offer memo not having any force majeure language in it, then we touched on the common law piece about impossibility. So you're going to want to take a look at that and see how that may intersect. And then in terms of an agreement that isn't signed by both parties, I think the critical piece there is, was there an understanding and an intent by both parties on both sides that you did reach a final agreement that had no material terms that were still subject to review? So if you look back at your email exchanges and you said something like, let's say you've been negotiating your contract, and then right at the end, after you've gone through your redlining process, everyone's like, great, we're agreed on terms, let's send this out for signature, but then only one party signs, then you might have an argument that, well, there was an intent there, and then you want to also look to what parties performed in reliance on that partially executed contract. For example, were services beginning to be rendered? Was money spent? Did you start building a set, for example, or whatever the kind of specific facts are for your type of arts organization? So you want to see kind of where you were in the line of execution and reliance on that partially executed contract. And then it all kind of dovetails back with the relationship. So having that conversation with the other party and saying, well, listen, that we started doing A, B, and C when this force majeure event occurred. How are we going to resolve this? Because the next big question a number of you asked is, how do we look to the future in terms of when to reschedule, postpone events, because that's, up in the air. And I think the short of it is, and we're running out of time, so I'll just be quick, is it's hard to tell. So one thing that I would think is you don't want to find yourself in a position in, 2 months having to do this whole review again. So I'm not sure that any of us will know or have any insights in the near term, but I would just caution against the time, energy, and resources needed to have the same dialogue in the short term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Guys, that was amazing. That was like a crash course. I felt like I was back in law school again.
Okay,
Thank you for that. That was pretty intense. Lots of questions, some that weren't answered, but I think you covered all the big ones. There were a load of questions about streaming, because that's where the world has all gone in the last couple of weeks. We are planning to put together another webinar, hopefully in the next week or so, where we're really going to dig into streaming questions. I want to take a quick minute to talk about some of the visa issues that people are experiencing. So I'm going to do that for a couple minutes, and then we're going to wrap up. Most important piece of information: visas are still petitions are still processing at USCIS. That is still happening, so you can still file petitions. You can file as long in advance as you want to. So if you want to be thinking about November, you can file those petitions now if you feel confident that shows can happen in November. US consulates are essentially closed for these kinds of visas, so nobody's getting visas issued. We have no idea when they're going to where they're going to open again and start issuing visas, so it's anybody's guess. Premium processing is suspended, which kind of makes sense because nobody's in a hurry to go anywhere right now. We'd have no idea when it will resume. USCIS has announced that they are extending the period of time allowed for responding to requests for evidence. That's actually good news, because they're also issuing a lot of requests for evidence, which is also kind of good news. What we're seeing a lot of is if you've filed a petition seeking visas to cover dates which are now unlikely to be happening, they're in many cases issuing requests for evidence saying, hey, it looks like these dates aren't happening. They're their wording isn't very good, but the idea is they're like, are you sure you really want to do this? That's good news, because now we have 120 days before you need to respond to that. And in the meantime, we're working very closely with Heather Noonan, Legal American Orchestras, and other arts organizations to try to convince Homeland Security to allow arts organizations to amend the dates that are in petitions that have already been filed. I don't know if they're going to do it, but it seems like that's what we're all heading toward. We are asking USCIS to allow petitioners to seek changes in the dates listed on pending petitions. We are asking USCIS to allow petitioners to seek changes in petitions that have already been approved. That's a longer shot. There's no precedent for that, and although we are asking for it, it's hard to know whether they're going to go with that. We're also discussing whether there's any way that embassies can issue visas for time periods which are not the time periods that are on the petitions that are approved. That's an even farther shot because it's against the law, but there may be a waiver around that. Again, keep an eye on the Artists from Abroad website for updates about that kind of thing. We are asking USCIS to resume premium processing as soon as possible, but I think there's a significant capacity questions at CIS. They are still processing petitions, but it's unclear why they stopped processing premium processing petitions, but probably because they're dealing with capacity issues. We will be seeing longer processing times when all this starts up again, I assume. Can't imagine there's not going to be delays. How to proceed with applications for summer events with consulates closed? Well, if you think the event's going to happen, file the petition, try to get it approved. With any luck, the embassies will be open in time. That's the best advice I can get you. Is it realistic to think about visas for fall tours? I have no idea. Maybe. I think I'm out of time. There's some more questions here, but keep an eye on Tamizdat's website for updates on immigration issues. Keep an eye on the Artists from Abroad website for the same updates. We're working together to keep the arts community informed about what's happening out there in regards to visas and artist mobility issues. Teresa, is it time, or Angus, is it time for you to come back? All right.
I'd like to offer thanks to our panelists, Sachedina, Heather Noonan, Heather VanDyke, Paul Bassman, and especially Matthew Covey for this wonderfully informative webinar presented by APAC, the Alliance for Performing Arts Conferences. Please do take a few minutes to provide feedback by responding to the brief survey that will appear in a new window when this webinar ends, and we look forward to you all joining APAC and its various members online for future learning opportunities. Thanks a lot, Matthew, and have a wonderful day. Stay safe, everybody.